This is Mae Brussell from Carmel, California. It's tape number 403, dated August 24th, 1979, and it's side 1. This is part 2 of my chronological order. It's not in order, actually, but some important events that have affected our lives up to the present time, and I'm running down these dates for you. This is a continuation of the tape of last week. In case some of you have ordered this, you'll need the first part that goes with it. You'll have to back order that back tape if you're ordering just by numbers. I left off last week with the start of the National Socialist Movement that was born in Germany, February 24th, 1920. That was the year that Adolf Hitler's party was forming, and it also was the year that British intelligence and the OSS, to become the CIA, will set up mind control experiments in Canada, in Toronto, Canada, that later will be conducted all over the United States and then later applied all over the world. April 20th, 1920, Reinhard Gehlen joined the new German army. The Treaty of Versailles said that Germany couldn't rearm, but there was no intention of observing this treaty because they now had the Bolsheviks to face on the other side in Europe, and they preferred to arm the industrialists. The powers that be in Washington and in Paris, in England, decided to rearm Germany in preference to having to coexist with a communist regime. They sent armored vehicles, aircraft, submarines, and tanks, and conspired systematically and secretly to control this police state. By November 1933, there was this election, which was a sham. The Nazis won 92% of the votes. In order to get that percentage of votes, they had to kill all their opponents, and Mr. Gumbel has written a series of books in Germany that were published by Seymour Millman in this country on the perversion of the courts in Nazi Germany and the systematic assassination of at least 400 political and public officials before Hitler could win the election in 1933. July 25th, 1921 was 3 years after the Russian Revolution, and the Council of Foreign Relations was formed. The Council of Foreign Relations was developed into various groups: the Rockefeller Group, the Morgan Group, the Manufacturer Hanover Trust, the Boston Group, Chicago Group, the Bank of America Group, the Mellon Group, the Cleveland Group, the insurance groups, which were 20 companies, savings banks, which were 15 companies, utilities, transportation, retailers, and the industrial group, which is 40 industries. And then the lords of the press were involving the TV, the newspapers, the magazines. The Council of Foreign Relations meets regularly and determines state policies, international policies. Everything that affects our country has been programmed and come out from there. The counterpart is the Hoover Institute, the think tank out on the West Coast. And this is a counterpart of the Council of Foreign Relations, more radical even than the Council of Foreign Relations. This was actually set up in 1941, but in 1921, at the Leland Stanford University in California, because of graduate Herbert Hoover and his involvement with that university, they began to ship out the files of the Ukraine, the Tsar's secret police files. That was in 1921. They were shipped to Stanford University. By 1941, the offices that held these buildings were moved to a new building. I was going to Stanford from 1940 to 43, but none of our teachers explained what was in the Stanford Tower, and anything about those buildings was not encouraged. Studying Western history or Western Civ, we weren't told what was there. Just jumping ahead, the librarian for this repository of fascist doctrines and Nazi doctrines, a gentleman by the name of Glenn Campbell, not the musician, with a PhD from Harvard, went on to be the advisor to Barry Goldwater when he was running for president in 1964. He works with Ronald Reagan, and Reagan appointed him to the Board of Regents, the University of California. He was the gentleman behind the firing of Angela Davis and keeping Eldridge Cleaver off the campus. persons involved with the Hoover Institute that was set up, as I say, after the czarists were out. It was set up in 1921. One of the directors is David Packard, who was at the meeting in Monterey, California in July with Mr. Schmidt from Germany and Alexander Haig and Henry Kissinger and Mr. Schultz and Mr. Hewlett Packard. All of them were at the home of Mr. Bechtel here in Monterey, California. The Institute Board of Directors is a who's who of the very far right wing, represented by General Electric, Mobil Oil, Los Angeles Times, Mirror, Adolph Coors, Standard Oil, William Simon, former Secretary of the Treasury. That was in 1921 when the Tsarist papers were brought to California. 1922, the Union of Soviet Socialist Republics, the USSR, became a state, and in that year Benito Mussolini, the founder of fascism in Italy, became the premier of Italy, creating a dictatorship at that time, and Adolf Hitler was being groomed in Germany for the takeover of the government in 1933. Mussolini was put in by British intelligence. He came to power to eliminate, in quotes, the mafia from Sicily, which really means incorporating the mafia into the fascist system. The Council of Foreign Relations in 1922 was meeting, and in 1923 Hitler's party was getting off the ground with a good start. It's when he instigated Interpol, the international police in Vienna, headed by the special agents of Adolf Hitler, the SS, and then the data banks were collected on who should be killed and who can live, and information on all families that they had in Western Europe at the time. Now it's expanded. In 1922, Aristotle Onassis was selling newspapers in Argentina and soon would become on his way to becoming a millionaire. The tobacco that he sold was allegedly hashish and dope, and he would import it from the Greeks and from Turkey, and became a very accomplished businessman down in Buenos Aires at that time. In 1922, Henry Luce started Time magazine, and that became the official media for the system, the fascist system, and the organizations that took control of our various branches of life. As I read off the Council of Foreign Relations, you can see the banking, the utilities, the merchants, and so forth. In 1923, Hitler was active in Munich. He was in prison then, wrote Mein Kampf, but was leading demonstrations in Vienna and in Europe and writing his plans for the future. As I said, 1923 was the formation of Interpol. After the Versailles Treaty, this was put together. It means International Police. 1938 to 39, Adolf Hitler used the Interpol extensively, and then his head of the Interpol, Reinhard Heydrich, who was the originator of the Jewish solution of gassing the Jews and so forth, was chief of the Nazi police. Heydrich was later assassinated in 1942, which caused a multiple series of murders in Poland as reprisal for his death. Interpol has a history I'll fill in later through the years as we go to it, but it developed up through the 50s. It then went into opium and narcotics traffic in France, dealing through Indochina. In 1953, Colonel Lansdale had a 6-week tour of Indochina and saw the French money coming from opium harvest. In 1945 to 46, the OSS and the CIA took over the Marseille ports and combined with Interpol and the mafia dealers in the narcotics traffic. Later, it became the heroin center of Western Europe, the Marseille group. And, of course, at the time of Watergate, they were linked to the Nixon connections, the mafia connections. Interpol has been an international police and a drug trafficking operation and an organization for possible terror or reprisal since it was formed, and this was in 1923 when it was formed. President Harding was poisoned in San Francisco in 1924. He was in the midst of the Teapot Dome scandal that involved various personages. I don't have time on the tape to go through all of them, but the Doheny oil was one branch that was involved with the Harding scandal. And Noah Dietrich, who steps into the life of Howard Hughes 1 year later, was representing the Doheny oil interests and had worked for Doheny Oil. Lenin died in 1924 and Stalin took over. He began a purge of his opponents and thousands of officials were executed. In 1925, the Institute of Pacific Relations was formed, and it was from 10 different countries taken from the Round Table Group, and it was another front of conniving and manipulating of various lives and countries through their meeting places. As I say, the Bilderberger and the Trilateral and the Council of Foreign Relations aren't the only types of organizations that have had meetings. The Bohemian Grove takes place in the summer. The top leaders of this country and from all over the world are there right in California in July, having their get-togethers and planning their strategies. It's supposed to be a week of fun, but you can imagine what goes on between these various heads of states at that time. It's very well written up in a book by Domhoff called The Bohemian Grove. In 1924, Howard Hughes Sr. died. Now, Howard Hughes Sr. had invented a tool bit that was responsible for the drilling of oil for all the major oil companies, and he would not sell it. He leased this oil bit and had the monopoly, total monopoly on it. Right after he died, Howard was introduced to a man who came from California, a certified public accountant by the name of Noah Dietrich, and he went to court to prove that young Howard, who was age 19 and now an orphan, could handle the Hughes Tool Company. This tool bit could dig through the hardest surfaces of the world, and it was John Paul Getty who said that without it he wouldn't be worth 25 cents. So Standard Oil and Shell Oil and Getty Oil and Humble and all the oil companies were dependent upon leasing this particular bit that gets through the hardest surfaces, so that Howard had a monopoly, but he wasn't interested in that. He was interested in designing airplanes and flying, and he went to Hollywood to buy up the RKO to make the movie studio his toy. The chronology of the life of Howard Hughes is terribly important because he was violently anti-communist. He affected the movie industry with his politics. He was sympathetic to the beliefs and the statements of Adolf Hitler, and later the Hughes organization could be a front for what I call the Nazification of America, because by later taking care of the body of Howard and getting him out of public life, his organization still was used for assassination teams and chicanery that was done by the government only under the guise of the Howard Hughes organization. Back to the chronology, in 1930, a large group of Russians, fascists, came to the United States. They were in Harbin, Manchuria from 1925 until 1930 and had their own fascist Nazi party, and then moved to Connecticut, to Putnam, Connecticut. And this was a nucleus of strong white Russian community in that part of the country that had an influence upon various congressmen and public officials in the area. The invasion of the Tsarists and the Nazi rocket scientists were terribly important to changing the picture of this country from what it was before World War I and II. In 1930, the Broda Band, the same religious group, the Afrikaners that I talked about before, began instigating the process of separating their children from their homes. Starting at age 7, they were given away from their homes to the church, and they got up at very early hours of the morning, 5 or 6 o'clock, they still do, and pray, and God and the state became one, and they became part of the Nazi secret society called Des Ahnen Erbe. That's the Broder bands, and the control of small children in the church group, taking them away from the family and making them part of the state, was done by the Afrikaners in South Africa. By 1931, Aristotle Onassis was moving up the scale from Argentine, a very important area just prior to World War II, and after World War II, he had bought 6 freighters and resigned as a Greek consul in Argentine and was getting into the oil freighting business. Mr. E.J. Gumbel, the author I talked about before, who wrote books 4 Years of War Lies, 2 Years of Political Murders, and 4 Years of Political Murders, was described in Time magazine September the 5th, 1932. It said, "The Nazis had a victory today. Gumbel was ousted as the professor at Heidelberg. He was telling the students they should grow turnips instead of decorating war memorials. This was a big day for the university, the purging of a man who was exposing the political assassinations that were taking place. In 1933, the next year, was the Reichstag fire by the Nazis when Adolf Hitler came in power to blame the communists, the youth, the labor movement, and to begin mass arresting all opponents to the National Socialist Party, and Hitler's Black Order followed in 1934. But in 1932, the man who had been writing books and exposing the Nazi regime and the death list, the hit list, was removed from the campus in Heidelberg. This is important because the death list was still going on in 1973, November 15th, 1973. There was an article that the Italian fascists at that time had a death list of 1,617 Italians, that they had a strong political organization and a chain of crimes that were committed to get ready for the Italian fascist takeover the next time around. The neo-Nazis, the West Germans, had their death roll, and they were working with the Italians and the assassination teams of Argentina, Brazil, the San Francisco police, the Los Angeles police, I believe, are linked to these various rightist organizations. These are masterminded in Spain, and is believed by a Princess Bourvier, who is involved in these conspiracies, right-wing conspiracies, and the death list is also available if you take Interpol and the Mormon Data Bank and the genealogy of people. You can make up a list of who opposes various administrations and who has to be wiped out. Prince Bourvier was a World War II hero. He was the leader of a small group, a clandestine group of rightists, and he disappeared in 1971 in Spain, but they believe it's his activity that was responsible, exposed in 73, of this death list of that many people. So that is multiplied. In Germany it was 400 before Hitler came to power, but in order to get fascism back in Italy or in the United States or Germany, the deaths have been many, many thousands more than this. But in 1973 there was an article on the death list of the Italians. In 1933, Adolf Hitler got the majority in the Reichstag. Adolf Hitler made the cover of Time. By then, Henry Luce was beginning Fortune magazine for the financiers. In March of 1933, Hitler took absolute power over the German people, and the book burning began by May of 1933. The concentration camp at Dachau was established in March of 1933. In April, the Jewish boycott was declared, and all Jewish businesses were to be boycotted. April 7th of 1933, all Jews were dismissed from civil service and denied admission to the bar. April 26th of that year was the formation of the Gestapo. May the 2nd was the dissolution of the free trade, and as I say, the book burning began, and the German state and the Nazi Party were launched. Across from Germany over the United States, Jack Ruby had moved from Chicago to Los Angeles to Santa Anita with the mobsters, and he was working with John Rosselli, who was assassinated at the time of the Senator Church hearings on organized crime and the Kennedy assassination. Rosselli worked with Sam Giancana and Robert Mayu from the Howard Hughes organization to set up assassination teams, and Jack Ruby was moved from Chicago to Santa Ana with Rosselli, John Rosselli, in 1933. In 1934, there was a plot to seize the White House. It's written up in a book by Jules Archer, and the book came out in 1973, but this was in 1934. This plot was planned. Hitler was in power, but put in there by the U.S. corporations, and goodness knows we could put many, many dates into these vacant places. There's a big story in that. Mussolini was in Germany, and the United States bankers and corporations wanted to seize the White House away from Franklin Roosevelt. They didn't like Roosevelt, and they were going to use the veterans from former wars to get this going. There's a congressional report, and it's filed February 15th, 1935. On the report, it went to Congress. It was verified. Nobody was prosecuted. before Roosevelt was in office, Harding had wanted a dictatorship. I have a copy of the New York Times, large, whole front section page, Harding wants a dictatorship. But after Franklin Roosevelt was elected, and we still had the electoral system, or it seemed we did, there was this complicated plan to take over the United States government. A man by the name of J. Howard Pugh, a longtime friend and associate of Robert Welch, and the man who formed the John Birch Society, contributed to what was going to be the overthrow of this country. It was called the American Liberty League, and George Smedley Butler was approached to head this group, and he's the man who exposed the plan to set up the American fascist dictatorship, to have a three-way going between the United States, Germany, and Italy. In 1933, by then Aristotle Onassis was a millionaire several times over, and he would soon be on his yacht with Winston Churchill and Jacqueline Bourvier, and a young man by the name of John Kennedy would be visiting his yacht with his all-German crew out in the islands off of Greece. In 1934, the Swiss banks became the Hall of Secrecy. There's a book, The Swiss Bank Connection, by Leslie Walker, on the use of the Swiss banks from 1934 on for funding fascism and rightist cause, and the connivings that went on in Bern, Switzerland with Credit Suisse. Credit Suisse later became the funding for Permindex that was behind the plans to kill Charles de Gaulle, that set up assassination teams in Oaxaca, Mexico, worked with Clay Shaw, who was on the board of directors of Permindex, an organization from Montreal and New Orleans and all over the world, Italy and various countries, with the assassination teams involved with Permindex. The Torba document talks about Roy Cohn working with Permindex. Roy Cohn also worked with Aristotle Onassis and Johnny Meyer. At the time, they were making a cash settlement for Jacqueline Onassis's divorce, her settlement of $26 million. But we'll get into that a little later. I don't want to rush this now. Henry Luce has been chronicled very, very carefully by Charles Spears. He talks in his chronologies that he has his running chronology of the covers of Time magazine of Mussolini and Adolf Hitler over and over again, and later Chiang Kai-shek, Henry Luce, Time, Life, and Fortune, was promoting the various fascisms and was a big power behind giving recognition to Mussolini and Adolf Hitler and giving them credibility and praising them for the job that they were doing. Luce wrote in 1938, "National Socialism of Hitler is thoroughly misunderstood in the United States. It is a thrill, I confess it, to touch, however briefly, such a period as the Germans under Hitler. I know of no such men of courage in America. We have forgotten in America what it is like to be with men who will fight. We need more of the German way in America. This is necessary to civilization." Throughout the years 1934, 36, 38, on up till war was declared, we were supplying Adolf Hitler with arms. General Motors Company, Ford Motor Company, were suppliers of 90% of the armored trucks that Hitler used and 70% of the Reich's medium and heavy trucks. In 1934, while this was going on, the propaganda for fascism in the media across the nation, the Randolph Hearst papers, has been exposed by George Seldes. He covered this whole area in his little news sheet, in fact, and they've now been reproduced in large volumes, 4 volumes, and he goes into the news media and their support in addition to Henry Luce. In 1934, Bruno Richard Hauptmann kidnapped the Lindbergh baby. That was important because it involved persons from Germany and planted evidence, and there's indication that organized crime and other persons did the killing of the baby. What happened was that it turned Charles Lindbergh, an American hero, against his own home country, and he moved to Europe. In fact, he was supposed to move to Germany the day that they invaded Poland. He had been awarded honors by them later, in a couple of years further along, and Charles Lindbergh's pro-German stance was enhanced with his anti-American position after the baby was killed. In 1935, Germany took over Interpol. It was formed by them, but the Gestapo took it over completely. The home was originally in Austria, and then it was changed to Germany with its swastikas and decoration. Hitler marched into the Rhineland in 1936. Time magazine praised Hitler for that. Roosevelt was renominated that year. The Spanish Civil War began that year. That was the year our family took a trip around the world. I was just 15 at the time. We were in China when it was invaded. Manchuria was invaded by Japan. We were in Palestine when there were bombs and riots in Palestine, and then we were one of the last American families to ever leave Spain. The Civil War had begun, and there were guns along the roads where we traveled, and the hotel was bombed, and we were sitting with friends of ours that traveled with us in an empty dining room of a huge hotel, sitting there having our dinner, and the Civil War had actually begun, and hotels were bombed, and I didn't even have the faintest idea at age 15 what was going on. Life magazine was started in 1936. That was a very important event. It was the Life magazine that had the big cover article about Lee Harvey Oswald with the gun and the rifle, and the story that he was the assassin of John Kennedy. They used that big picture of Charles Manson with the eyes, making him look like a Rasputin type who had invaded the hippie music scene in California. James Earl Ray, the negligent with no family, the wanderer, who later turned out to have lots of support and money in the St. Louis area and was allowed to escape from the St. Louis prison. Life magazine covers up these crimes visually. They did a wonderful job of giving you instant news that was a lot of lies and praising the various assassination teams and not fingering them for the murderers that they were. Edward VIII abdicated in 1936. He was notorious for being pro-Nazi and moved down to the Bahamas later. And in 1935, just preceding that, they started the Juden Verboten. That means no Jews in German in 1935. Signs on the towns, villages, restaurants, and stores in Germany, Jews not allowed, Juden Verboten. And the Reichstag passed their Nuremberg laws, anti-Semitic laws, about being able to hire people who are non-Christians and going to universities and education. The Spanish Civil War of that period was the proving ground for Adolf Hitler and Mussolini. It was the time when the Vatican was paid off to stay out of the conflicts. They were to stay silent during the whole period of fascism in exchange for large hunks of property that made the Vatican very rich. And from 1936 to 39, it was a knockdown fight with America, in quotes, having a neutrality except for those courageous Lincoln Brigade members. And then Franco became the head of Spain, and the Loyalists were put down. In 1936, the Ford Foundation was started. They're slow learners. The Rockefeller Foundation was way ahead of them. Identified as a non-profit institution, and this would contribute to, in quotes, some of the solutions of problems, significant national, international problems, and of course, again, it became a medium to fund all outlets of communications, later to give grants, to control the news media, and I can't yet see what the Ford Foundation did. They were scandalous in rental problems and problems with labor and minority, but this was founded in 1936. And that was the same year that Hitler and Mussolini formed their Axis and their pact, and the same year that they included Japan in the pact. In 1936, Charles Lindbergh was inspecting the German Air Force, and ITT, an American corporation, was making airplanes for the Luftwaffe and supplying Adolf Hitler with all the means to wage his war. 1937, Amelia Earhart's plane flew down, and she disappeared. There's been books out, and the subject has been brought up that she is alive in New Jersey. That the purpose for keeping all of this secluded would be to escalate anti-Japanese feelings during the war, because she was a heroine for her flight records and her courage. And when her plane went down, it would cause people to believe that the Japanese had captured her. That was the story going around, and maybe whip up some feeling towards getting the war going a little stronger. By 1937, the Buchenwald concentration camps were open. Austria had been annexed to the Third Reich, and the same anti-Jewish principles and anti-Semitic laws were applied in Austria, and France failed to provide refuge for the German Jews. They said they wouldn't take them in. Passports of Jews were marked with the letter J to identify them. We're up to 1937 on the other side of this tape. We'll continue with that year, 1937. Getting ready for World War II. He bought an amphibian plane that he worked on and gave up the movie business, not to resume it again until 1939, from 32 to 39. In 1934, he visited the used tool company in Houston, Texas, for 5 days, and in the 30 years that it was taken over by Noah Dietrich, helping Howard, in quotes, helping Howard maintain the tool bit company. They still had the total monopoly on this tool bit. He had only been there on 5 occasions. That was in 1934. And in 1934, the used aircraft was formed in Santa Monica, California. So he was working with Lockheed, the used aircraft. And Noah Dietrich moved away from Howard to Houston, Texas in 1936. Howard remained in Hollywood with the starlets and the aircraft factory, used aircraft factory in 36. In 1936, Howard was in a car accident. He killed a person by the name of Gabe Meyer, and fingerprints were taken by the Los Angeles Police Department, but weren't used to identify the corpse when it was cashed in Houston, Texas, and later, much later, in 1976. In 1938, Howard was an American hero. He set the world flight record for around the world in 91 hours and 14 minutes. The Lockheed plane was built to his specifications, and up to that time, until he was drugged and taken control of and literally kidnapped, he was an extrovert. He had a ticker tape parade in New York, and he, as I say, he had a lot of women and starlets and company around him. He was an American hero and active with Jane Russell, Billy Dove, Faith Thalmerick, Jean Peters, Ida Lupino, Elizabeth Taylor, Ginger Rogers, Terry Moore, Bette Davis, Katharine Hepburn, and many, many more. He had a lot of friends, and he started getting political in the 1940s. He was making political contributions of $100,000 to $400,000, but I don't want to jump ahead. I want to describe a section. It's called Glimpses of World History by Mr. Nehru. This book came out in 1942, and it's describing the time period that we're in 1937. It's called The World in Conflict. And it said there was a kind of fascist international that had grown up, which not only carries an open, though undeclared war, but is intriguing in various countries and fomenting trouble to give it an opportunity to intervene. There is an open glorification of war and violence, false propaganda on an unprecedented scale. Under cover of the slogan of anti-communism, it advances its imperialist designs. In the United States of America, there have been Nazi conspiracies and trials. In France, in 1937, a conspiracy against the Republic was discovered. It was organized by the Cagoulards, the hooded men, as they were called, aided and supplied with arms from Germany and Italy. And it goes into the bombings and the murders that were committed by these men. In England, influential British foreign policy was made in a fascist direction. By 1937, the handwriting was on the walls for the international fascism that was to take place. In 35, there was the invasion of Abyssinia. In 36, Spain was attacked. In 37, China was invaded. In 38, Austria was invaded by the Nazis, and the world was going crazy with this fascism and horror. This book describes the takeover of Germany and Italy, and in 1937, the Cagoulards in France. France was completely sabotaged from the inside and was ready to collapse and be German. And later, it was Charles Lindbergh, who said, "Why don't you give up England and become German?" That was supposed to be something really beautiful. In 1937, the Germans were staking out Antarctica and set aside 600,000 square miles, and 5 years from that time, Germans would be moving there down to South America, Argentina, and Antarctica. Adolf Hitler had a strong interest in Antarctica. Later the astronauts would have, and would spend a lot of time down there. This was a place that fascinated the Germans and was used by Germans. The Washington Post in 1974 had an article about General Motors and Ford Motor Company building up Germany just prior to World War II and up to the point where the hostilities really got heavy, and then getting reparations afterwards. They converted all of their factories to war. They said that General Motors and Exxon subsidiaries, at the request of Nazi officials, joined the German chemists, and they supplied plants and mechanisms for the German armies and leaded fuel. And in 1938, General Motors' chief for overseas operation was awarded the Order of the German Eagle, first class, by Adolf Hitler, and they agreed to build their truck facility at Brandenburg, and they were sending weapons and building weapons throughout the war for the Wehrmacht and using the General Motors plants for the Luftwaffe, building up the German army. When the war was over, these same people got a lot of money in reparations. They got $33 million in cash. General Motors got $33 million in cash in credits from the United States for damages inflicted on their planes in the General Motors factories in Germany that they were making for Nazi Germany. And also ITT was making airplanes for the Nazi Air Force, and when the war was over, the American taxpayers paid them money to resettle in the Bahamas because of the damage done to their factories by United States troops. If that isn't a can of worms, think that went out. In 1938, Aristotle Onassis had his oil transport ship built, and he multiplied his fortune because during World War II the Germans wouldn't attack him, and he could take supplies and oil to Argentina and was always protected by the Germans. In 1938, a man named Herschel Greenspan killed a German, Ernest von Roth, because his parents had been deported from Germany to Poland. He was the secretary of the German embassy in Paris, and the retaliation was that famous Night of the Broken Glass, where riots broke out and stores and homes were destroyed and synagogues were destroyed and shops were looted. And November of that year, just 3 days later, 26,000 Jews were arrested and sent to concentration camps. Jewish children were expelled from all German schools, and the Aryanization was complete. It was compulsory to stop all Jewish industries, businesses, and shops. In 1938, the United States joined Interpol, that agency that was set up by the Gestapo and Meyer Heydrich, that had moved from Vienna to Germany, and J. Edgar Hoover became the vice president of Interpol in 1946 with the same Gestapo members. Heydrich was killed, but the others were still in there. Hoover was affiliated with the Nazis in Interpol since 1935 and was corresponding with them, the head of our Federal Bureau of Investigations, and, as I say, became vice president in 46. But in 38, the United States became active in Interpol, and we're still part of Interpol and sending them money and combined our police forces with them. In the book Armies of Spies by Joseph Galland, it describes the political climate in France, in many countries, but there's a section in France going on since 1933 and up till the fall of France, and it tells about small groups of spies that worked together and then formed armies, and they invaded various countries by the thousands and began spreading propaganda and tampering with the industries. They introduced livestock epidemics, making animals sick. They made a study of water supplies, communication, and transport systems, promoted assassinations and incidences, and were international wreckers, according to Mr. Galland, on a highly organized scale. And he goes into the Cagoulards in France, the Hooded Ones, as the United States Klan was escalating here, and Adolf Hitler's terror was reaching its full peak in 1939. The French had been weakened to such a point that there were secret cells set up by the Nazis. They had regular monthly meetings. Their violence was planned, as I say, their explosions. In fact, there was a matter known as the Rosselli Affair, and I don't know if this is related to the John Rosselli in this country or not. He was from a rich family a professor in Genoa, who was giving Mussolini trouble. And Brussell was joining the anti-fascist group, and he was visiting in France, and they had him killed, and the powers that be assumed it was the Italians that were killing, but it was really that cell network of Adolf Hitler's that had spread all over Europe. And according to this book, there were 200 families in France who owned the bulk of France's wealth, and I'm sure that's true today. So by 1939, the fascists were ready for Hitler to take over the country, just as the group wanted Hitler to take over the White House in 1934 in the United States. One of the covers for the fascism was the healing offices. Actually, it was a weapons collection, and it was heralded because of their hypnotism and their healing. And I'm wondering, today with so much holistic healing and massage parlors or healing services and the travelers, various people healing, if this couldn't be a cover over. Also, there were boarding houses run by genteel elderly ladies where heavily hooded male figures would come, and those were the Kagoulards, the counterpart of the Ku Klux Klan here, the hooded ones, and they had shortwave radios and accumulated addresses, and they worked with the Italian, German weapon systems. And in this book, Guillaume describes in his Secret Armies who's behind this. It was an organization called the CSAR, C-S-A-R, Committee Secret d'Action Revolutionnaire, and they were responsible, working with the Kagoulards in their secrecy, and they were synonymous with the Nazis in Germany, as I say, the fascists in Italy, and they followed the river and water transportations. This group, in the hooded ones, the part on the hooded ones, it tells about the Bourvier family. The Bourvier family was involved with the Tsar movement, that white Russian revolutionary extreme right-wing fascist group. The police got a lead in Africa or Morocco, and they brought back one young soldier by the name of Jean-Marie Bourvier from Paris. He was the son of a Parisian industrialist. He was serving in Africa, and he was named, along with some André Huguet, of murdering the Rosselli brother, that he was the part of the French Nazi fascist movement. And I wonder if Jacqueline Bourvier, she went to school at the Sorbonne in France, studied in France. She has French descendants. She was later to marry Aristotle Onassis, working with the Nazis in Germany and in Greece. And Jackie's father had an interesting background. Hugh Auchincloss, her father, was in Navy intelligence in World War II at a time when the Navy was bringing Nazis into the United States in Project Paperclip. They had this large home and estate in McLean, Virginia. His first marriage, Hugh Auchincloss's first marriage, was to Maya de Chepravitsky. I'll try and have space on the printed tape for you to get that down. A white Russian czarist, and these white Russian czarist teams were trained in terror that the hooded ones of the Kagoulards were, and Hugh's first marriage to her, this white Russian from the Tsar's entourage, took place at a time when he had a brokerage firm in New York, $160 million invested in a brokerage firm. This was Hugh Auchincloss, the stepfather of Jackie, but the Bourvier connections linked in France, at least, to the Nazis and the Kagoulards, the hooded ones, and then Mr. Auchincloss was heavily involved in counterintelligence with the white Russian community. At the time of the assassination, it turned out that George de Mohrenschildt, the man mentioned on the tape last week, whose father was manager of the Nobel oil fields for the Nobel family in the Baku region before the Tsars were kicked out, George de Mohrenschildt was a friend of Janet and Hugh Auchincloss. He knew them and had seen Jacqueline when she was a young girl or a young woman when he came to this country. De Mohrenschildt had been apprehended as a Nazi spy. He worked with the FBI, the CIA, the Defense Intelligence Agency. He had known cousins who were Nazis. So in with this enigma or this mystery of Jacqueline Bourvier is the question of their links to France, to the French Nazi counterintelligence group, the rightist groups, the Bourvier connections in this country, and the Auchincloss connections to the Tsarists and the same interlocking groups. in a running commentary in a newspaper on Jacqueline's birthday. There's been a series about her in addition to that article about the mystery of Jackie. And one edition of the Sunday paper described the situation in Dallas when John Kennedy was killed. And she was described as, this is the way the paper reads, her poise, her strength stunned the world. She didn't sleep. She never wept before the camera. She had stamina and dignity. She got up at 4 a.m. and planned every detail of the funeral to make it as close as possible to that of Abraham Lincoln. Now, Allen Dulles came to the minutes of the Warren Commissions with this. I have a story of the past assassinations, and it very closely parallels Lincoln. And one of the ways that the CIA covered up the murder of John Kennedy was to say, we could never find the answer. We've never solved the Lincoln murder. There were a lot of parallels between the Lincoln murder and the John Kennedy assassination, and she stayed up to plan the funeral to continue these parallels with the Lincoln assassination. This article describes her with a dry eye among all the people at the time of the funeral. It goes on to say, at the White House reception, she actually appeared radiant as she greeted dignitaries, smiling and shaking hands with Prince Philip of Britain, Emperor Haile Selassie, President Charles de Gaulle, and other heads of state. Later she went upstairs to the family sitting room for John's third birthday party, and she emerged as the most admired woman on earth. Then it says Jackie took an Adriatic cruise after Kennedy's funeral and assumed her new role as America's widowed queen, and it shows a picture of her holding hands with Aristotle Onassis, a really freaky combination. The Adriatic cruise was with Aristotle Onassis after John Kennedy was dead. I don't want to jump up to 63, but I just want to bring out, because this book goes into, in the Army of Spies, goes into the era of France in the 30s and the overthrow of the French government and the undermining of it, and the role of people like persons by the name of Bourvier wondering if they're blood relatives, even the death of a person named Rosselli, because later another Rosselli is going to be involved in the killing of a Bourvier. Are these coincidences? The links of George and Jean de Montchel to Jackie's stepfather, the relationship of him to the White Russian czar's entourage, I don't know, but I think they should be explored. And the Bourvier family in France was working with the Nazis, with the White Russian agents, and the Bouviers have been very much part of the anti-communist operations, the Nazi Onassis connections, Jackie's background, the backgrounds of her family, and the way she met John Kennedy have to be explored really much, much deeper. And then I think that all the mysteries about Jackie will be solved. The question that I said last week was an article, Jackie's a mystery without a motive. Of course, the bottom line was a $26 million settlement with Aristotle Onassis, and a lot of satisfaction and protection all down the line, and that would be motive for a lot of women for a lot less money. And particularly when politics are involved and when a man has betrayed you and taken on other women, it's a lot easier to do the job if you can fix him up with all kinds of women so you find underpants under your pillows and so forth. It's easier to get things done if they have to be done by instigating antagonisms towards that person that makes the job easier. If you understand what I'm trying to ask as a question. Is it possible? Yeah, I think it's possible. Incidentally, the Kagoulards and the Tsar, the organization called Tsar, and the rightists that were in France in 1939 had an instruction booklet on what to do in case they were ever caught murdering or bombing. And they said what you should do is blame the communists for the violence. Leave a handbook around with instructions written by the Communist Party. This happened at the time of the SLA farce when Patty Hearst was kidnapped. They had Carlos Marighiella's mini manual for urban guerrilla warfare left outside of the rooming house in Oakland when Dr. Marcus Foster was shot. Lee Harvey Oswald's Das Kapital was closely identified with him, the book that was referred to by 20 or 30 Tsarist Galen agents. They all had to say that he was reading Das Kapital on a coffee table. The important thing is that the handbook that was left for the Kagoulards and the Nazis, right down to the letter, was exactly what happened with other violences in this country that were to be blamed on the left. All Our friend Jack Ruby is now back in Chicago. There was a murder in one of the unions, and then the union was taken over by Paul Dorfman and Sam Giancana. Giancana later is to be involved in the John Kennedy assassination and works with the Howard Hughes, Robert Mayhew assassination teams, and then he himself was gunned down before he testified at the Senator Church Committee. 1939, when Germany invaded Poland, the Council of Foreign Relations was offering their assistance and their diagnosis of society's ills to the State Department. The State Department experts could be moved aside because the Council of Foreign Relations members had studied what they wanted from each country, and they were to give their advice. 1939 is the year that Howard Hughes met Charles Lindbergh, both politically right, both heroes with ticker tape parades, flying experts. Terry Moore told me when I was in Los Angeles that the meeting was a very great historical occasion, or hysterical, and I believe she told me she was there. It was in an airplane hangar. Lindbergh came out to California, and Howard Hughes was working on a plane, and everyone was in anticipation of these two great heroes, these weirdos, finally saying hello and meeting each other, because they had a lot in common, except they didn't want to acknowledge it in front of everybody. They worked with subterfuge. So Charles Lindbergh walked over to Howard Hughes, and Hughes walked over to Lindbergh, and they each said hello and parted. And that was their great meeting in 1939, the year that Germany began to occupy Czechoslovakia. Adolf Eichmann was in charge of the Prague branch of the Immigration Office. As I say, Germany invaded Poland in September of that year. A gentleman by the name of James Webb Young was in Washington, D.C. in 1939 to 1941. He was director of the Bureau of Foreign Affairs and Domestic Commerce, working for Nelson Rockefeller. He goes on to become vice president and director of J. Walter Thompson Agency, a front for the team that put Richard Nixon into the White House, and also a cover for the Central Intelligence Agency. And J. Walter Thompson's name comes out through Watergate, the tentacles and the control of advertising and selling presidents. Young, in 1939, was working in Washington, D.C. for Nelson Rockefeller. Later, in 1941, he becomes chairman of J. Walter Thompson. We find him in 1950 as a consultant to the Ford Foundation on mass communication, and it was this same man, Mr. Young, who began to supply the Elders of Prodigals of Zion, which was Hitler's great anti-Semitic paper, to the United States and to South America to begin the large hatred of Jews in Central and South America. The Ford Foundation was distributing these, and J. Walter Thompson, agent, was working Ford Foundation in their communications and getting this out. 1939 to 1941, Adolf Hitler was being assisted by Charles Lindbergh. In 1936 to 38, Hitler had made trips to Germany. That's when he told Britain, give up and become German. He worked with the German air officials. October the 18th, 1939, he received the Service Cross of the German Eagle, presented by Hermann Göring on orders of the Fuhrer. In 1940, Tom Dewey from New York was working with Lucky Luciano, the Mafia, and the OSS that's to become later the CIA. And when Tom Dewey runs for President of the United States, his vice president is none other than Earl Warren, who later became Chief Justice of the Supreme Court, who covered up the Kennedy assassination. In 1940, the Germans invaded Denmark and Norway. The Polish concentration camps at Lodz were sealed off. The Warsaw Ghetto was sealed off. Interpol had moved to Berlin, and Heydrich had built Hitler's hideaway in Antarctica. By 1940, that had been arranged by Meyer Heydrich. Winston Churchill, the great buddy of Aristotle Onassis, and the gentleman who visited the yacht for his, in quotes, getaways, became Prime Minister of England in 1940. There's a book called The Ciano Diaries, which describes Italy in 1940, the relationship between Hitler and El Duce, the attacks against England. They were both going to invade England, and Hitler was stalling, putting it off. They had a summit meeting, and they were going to have landings and conversations, and all of a sudden there were no more invasion plans of England, and Mr. Hess had flown over to England what was described as a plane crash. And then it turned out that he was making a deal with the British to stop attacking Great Britain, that Germany was going after the big bear, the Soviet Union, and they decided to let up on England and direct their energies to the east. That was the message he brought, and he's the one lone war criminal in prison today, unless that's a double there, taking his place, and the Russians have insisted that he stay there because it was those meetings in England that turned the tide of the war that made the decision, we'll get off your back and we'll go after Russia. In the United States, J. Edgar Hoover, the head of the FBI, who was sympathetic to the Nazis and corresponding with them up through this period, was asked by Franklin Roosevelt in 1940. They agreed that they should check into hundreds of persons who were criticizing Charles Lindbergh, and the data of the FBI spying on newsmen, government officials, and civil rights leaders began in 1940. President Roosevelt allegedly ordered wiretaps on the telephones of his closest aides, and they wanted to know who was against the Nazi policies of our great hero, Charles Lindbergh. The Germans invaded Yugoslavia in 1941. Hitler invaded Russia in 1941, and this was a very important date. June the 13th, Hitler invaded Russia, and they tried to take Moscow. And in 1941, in December, the United States entered war. Pearl Harbor was attacked. In August of 1941, a Yugoslav named Desko Popov came to the United States to give a message to the FBI. He was involved as a counterspy in Germany for British intelligence, and he claimed that he knew in advance that Pearl Harbor would be attacked, and J. Edgar Hoover would have nothing to do with him, and he names the place where he met J. Edgar Hoover twice. Later, Clarence Kelly in 1974 said Mr. Popov is lying, and Popov insists that he's telling the truth, and he came forward and he said that he wants to make this country immune from future mistakes by getting to the bottom of this one. If responsible people could be made to answer for this, then it wouldn't happen again. And he refers to Watergate exposing certain things. He said, I'd like the FBI to get out of its foxhole. They were so stupid during that time. Hoover wanted to protect his empire, and he didn't want anyone else getting credit for doing it. Now, I believe it's more sophisticated than that, but that was his explanation on why we let Pearl Harbor happen. But it was like he was thinking of the Lusitania or other accidents that take place. There was a reason for us being attacked first, and then we would get into the war, other than our being the aggressor and making the war first. So J. Edgar Hoover avoided this. We had been arming Japan since the early 30s. Up to the day that war broke out, we were sending medals and stockpiles. Another important date in 1941 that went on until 1945 was the expose of Japanese germ warfare atrocities. And I really feel that to understand the present, and I'm running down this historical chronology, because we can't understand today or tomorrow unless we realize how much went under, or some of the things. This, again, is a fraction of some of the things that went down. But in 1941 to 1945, during World War II, the Japanese did bacteriological warfare experiments. They escaped all prosecution because they shared their findings with the American occupation forces. The experiments were done in Manchuria from 1941 to 1945, where the scientists killed prisoners. They infected them with plague, cholera, anthrax, and typhoid. And now these people who did it hold prominent positions in the Japanese government today. The Japanese unit in the wartime was called Number 73. Before they surrendered, workers were killed in this camp, and the remains of the buildings were dynamited to conceal the activities. The researchers stayed out of the major cities. They ran death factories, like in Germany. They did the experimentation of warfare. Their headquarters were in Harbin, China, the same place where in 1930 the white Russian community was living, and many of them came to form a fascist bloc in Connecticut when they moved to the United States. They disguised themselves as a clean water epidemic prevention center, and this is what I think that Germ Control Center in Atlanta, Georgia is, a front for future genocide and disease experiments such as the swine flu or the Legionnaire disease. Victims were vaccinated, then they were exposed to disease, At least 3,000 were put to death, and guards and doctors were recruited. Some of the best pathologists from Japan were put into this operation. They were from Kyoto University, and as I say, they have high power today in the Japanese government and worked at the Harbin Epidemic Control Center, and they used Chinese prisoners from Manchuria and other prisoners. Our time is out. Next week I'll try to conclude as far as I could get and get back to it later, maybe some more chronology going on from 1941 until the end of World War II.